Welcome to the Darkling Radio, your home for the darkest, creepiest, and most chilling stories. Step inside if you dare, because here, nightmares aren't just imagined, they're real. When Lucas Reed and Emma Voss took their first night shift as delivery drivers, they thought it would be just another routine job. But on the outskirts of the city, in abandoned streets, shrouded in fog, something unseen was waiting, patient, silent, and watching their every move. One wrong step, one simple delivery, and they realized some packages are never meant to be delivered. I had just started my night shift as a delivery driver, the city already feeling different after dark. The streets were quiet, eerily quiet, with only the occasional hum of a distant car or the faint buzz of a streetlight flickering overhead. My van's headlights cut through the mist rising from the asphalt, and every shadow along the roadside seemed too long, too deliberate, as if watching me. The first few deliveries were normal enough apartment complexes, convenience stores, small offices, but a growing unease had settled in my chest, a tight knot I couldn't ignore. The next address appeared on my GPS, a location on the outskirts of the city. I didn't usually go there, the area known for old factories and abandoned lots that smelled faintly of rust and decay. I tried to shake off the nervous feeling in my gut, blaming it on the isolation, but my hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I noticed the temperature inside the van drop suddenly. The heater was on, but it felt useless. The route twisted past broken fences and overgrown yards, the dim streetlights flickering like they might die at any moment, leaving me alone in darkness. When I finally saw the house, my stomach churned. It was old, its paint peeling, the windows black and empty like the eyes of a corpse. The front door was slightly ajar, swinging gently with the wind. I told myself it was probably just carelessness. Maybe someone had left it open. Still, a shiver ran down my spine as I stepped out and carried the package toward the porch. Something didn't feel right. The yard was uneven, covered in dirt and weeds, and I noticed footprints leading from the edge of the property straight to the door. They were small, far smaller than mine, and they didn't stop at the porch. They vanished into the shadows that clung to the house. I paused, my heart hammering. A simple delivery, I reminded myself. I had to stay professional. I knocked lightly on the door, hoping to startle someone into opening it. Silence. The street around me was empty, completely still. Then I caught a glimpse of movement in the darkened windows, a fleeting shadow that vanished the moment I blinked. My breath caught and I stepped back instinctively, my fingers brushing against the package. A chill wind cut across the porch, carrying with it a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. I froze, my mind racing. There was no one else around, yet the sound continued, slow and deliberate. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I had a job to do, and I couldn't ignore it. Carefully, I set the package on the doorstep, the weight heavier than it should have been, almost like it resisted being placed down. As I turned back toward the van, the wind shifted, and I thought I heard whispering. At first I convinced myself it was the wind passing through the broken boards of the old house, but the sound was too precise, too deliberate. It was faint, yet insistent, brushing against my ear with words I couldn't understand. My skin crawled, goosebumps rising across my arms. I glanced at the open door one last time. There, in the darkness beyond the threshold, I could have sworn a shape was waiting for me, hunched low, barely visible but unmistakably there. I hurried back to the van, fumbling with the keys as my heart raced. The engine roared to life, and I backed onto the street, trying to convince myself it was over. The mist clung to the edges of the road, curling around the tires like smoke, and I kept stealing glances at the house in my rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw movement at the windows again, a figure, pale and indistinct, standing and watching me leave. My pulse hammered in my ears, the engine noise fading into a ringing that made it hard to think clearly. By the time I reached the next streetlight, the sensation of being watched hadn't left. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally along the empty sidewalks, and every parked car held the potential for something hiding behind it. I forced myself to focus on the GPS, on the next delivery, but my mind kept returning to that house. Something about it felt alive, almost aware of me being there. The thought of the footprints, leading into the shadows, gnawed at my mind. What had made them? Where had they gone? As I drove on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't left the house behind at all. Something had followed me. I was sure of it. And when I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, I thought I saw a figure standing in the middle of the street, pale and still, its eyes locked on me. My stomach turned cold, and I realized the headlights didn't reach far enough to touch it. Yet somehow it didn't move, didn't disappear, just waited. The street grew darker, the mist thicker, and the whispering returned, barely audible but unmistakable. It wasn't the wind. Something was calling to me, patient, silent, and hungry. I gripped the wheel tighter, knowing I had to leave it behind, but deep down, I knew the night had only just begun, and whatever was in that house wasn't finished with me. The next delivery should have been simple, routine, a small package to an apartment downtown just a few blocks from the highway. I told myself that after the previous stop I needed a normal run, something to shake off the creeping dread. But as I started driving, the GPS began acting strangely. The route it gave me twisted through streets I didn't recognize, narrow alleys that cut behind industrial buildings and past fenced-off lots. At first I thought it was a glitch, maybe an update gone wrong, but the longer I drove, the more the surroundings seemed wrong. Street lights flickered overhead, some dying in the middle of their hum, leaving patches of darkness where shadows pooled like water. Every time I glanced down at the GPS, the route would redraw itself, circling me back in ways that made no sense. I felt a twinge of panic but tried to stay calm. After all, I had done this job hundreds of times. Just keep going, I told myself. I arrived at the apartment building, a tall structure that should have felt familiar. The lobby was empty, polished marble gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Long shadows stretched across the floor, sharp and unnatural. I stepped inside, package in hand, and felt the weight of silence pressing down. No elevators were moving, no hum of air conditioning, nothing but my footsteps echoing off the walls. Then I noticed it. On a security monitor near the front desk, a figure was moving up the stairs. Slow, deliberate, but the stairs themselves were empty. I blinked and checked again, nothing. My heart skipped. The monitor must be malfunctioning, I told myself. Yet the unease in my chest refused to settle. I took the elevator to the 13th floor, the walls of the shaft reflecting my anxious expression back at me in faint light. The doors opened to a dim hallway, walls painted in muted tones, lights flickering just enough to cast shifting shadows that seemed to follow me. The apartment number on my GPS matched the one in front of me, and I reached the door. But as I stepped closer, the lights in the hallway dimmed further, and the reflection in the polished elevator doors behind me seemed wrong. My face looked pale, almost too thin, and the eyes staring back at me were larger, darker than my own. For a brief moment, panic surged through me, and when I blinked, it was just me again. I placed the package in front of the door and stepped back, ready to knock, but then I noticed something impossible. The package in my hands, heavy, rectangular, wasn't the one I had just been carrying. It was the same as the previous delivery, the one I left at the old house on the outskirts of the city. My fingers fumbled with the wrapping, heart hammering. I could feel the edges pulsating, almost alive. I dropped the package, but it didn't hit the floor in the way it should. Instead, it hovered for a brief second, then landed with a soft thud. I froze, every nerve on edge. Then I heard it a whisper, soft and fleeting, brushing against my ear, unintelligible but insistent. My skin prickled, the hair on the back of my neck standing straight. I glanced around the empty hallway, expecting to see something, but there was no one. Only the dim corridor stretching endlessly ahead. The air seemed thicker now, heavier, as if gravity itself had increased. I could feel my pulse and my temples pounding, and the walls seemed to close in. Shadows stretched across the hallway in impossible angles, and the flickering lights cast shapes that moved against the rhythm of reality. I wanted to leave, to run back to the elevator, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. Something brushed against my shoulder, soft and wet. I jerked back, heart racing, but no one was there. My eyes darted down the hallway, half expecting to see a figure, a glimpse of movement, but there was only darkness. The whispers returned, low and urgent, as if circling me, following me. And then I noticed the number on the apartment door. It wasn't right. The digits twisted, elongating and contorting, forming patterns that made no sense. My stomach turned cold. Something about this building, this floor, even this hallway, was wrong. The GPS still showed the next address, but I had stopped trusting it, stopped trusting anything around me. I took a hesitant step backward, almost tripping over the floating package. My breath caught when I realized that the package now seemed to pulse with faint light from inside, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. A soft creaking sound echoed from the hallway ahead, like someone or something was moving toward me, slow and deliberate. I wanted to run, to leave, but the building seemed endless. The elevator doors behind me reflected only darkness, and the corridor ahead stretched farther than it should have. The whispering grew louder, circling around me, urging me forward and holding me in place at the same time. I knew, without understanding how, that I wasn't alone. Something unseen was watching, patient and deliberate, waiting for me to make the wrong move. The hallway seemed to shift around me, the lights flickering in a rhythm that mimicked my heartbeat, and I realized with a shiver that whatever was here had followed me from the outskirts. It was patient, it was waiting, and when I finally turned my gaze back to the hovering package, the faint outlines of faces seemed to press against the wrapping from inside. Mouths open in silent screams, staring at me with hollow eyes that burned into my mind. Shaken from the elevator encounter, I tried to convince myself it had been a trick of the mind, a mixture of exhaustion and stress from the night shift. The city outside looked familiar enough, yet every street I turned onto felt distorted, as if the world itself had warped around me. Shadows clung to the edges of buildings in ways that made no sense, stretching across sidewalks like dark fingers trying to grab at the tires of my van. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, and every nerve in my body screamed that I wasn't alone. Though the streets appeared empty, the next delivery was to a small house wedged between two abandoned buildings. The structure seemed almost swallowed by the darkness around it, the windows grimy, reflecting only the pale glow of my van's headlights. As I drove closer, I noticed the front door. It was scratched, deep gouges jagged across the surface, like someone or something had tried to force its way through. My stomach churned. I had delivered packages to hundreds of houses, but none had ever looked like this. And none had ever made my hands shake before opening a simple screen door. I grabbed the package from the van, heavier than it should have been, and stepped onto the cracked walkway. The air smelled sour, a mix of damp wood and something metallic that made my stomach twist. I could hear a faint hum, a vibration that seemed to echo from inside the walls, low and insistent. I paused, hand hovering over the door, feeling the energy around me pulsed like a heartbeat out of sync with my own. Carefully, I set the package down on the porch and stepped back. That's when I heard the softest, wet sound of something moving inside. At first I told myself it was just the house settling, but the rhythm didn't match. It was deliberate, like someone dragging themselves across the floor. I wanted to leave, to run back to my van, but an almost magnetic pull drew my gaze back to the front door. The gap under the door widened slightly, and I saw a hand. Not a normal hand. It was pale, elongated, and twisted. The skin stretched unnaturally over the knuckles. Dark fluid clung to the edges of the fingers, glistening in the dim light. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst through my chest. I stumbled backward instinctively, nearly tripping over the uneven porch. My breath came in shallow, quick bursts, and a cold sweat ran down my neck. The hand disappeared as suddenly as it appeared, leaving only the faint echo of wet dragging sounds. I could feel the weight of eyes on me, something just beyond the door, something patient, watching, waiting. Every instinct screamed to leave, and I ran toward the van without looking back. The engine roared to life, and I pulled onto the street, but the house stayed in my mind, etched there in a way I couldn't shake. The fog in the neighborhood had thickened, curling around the van like smoke, twisting the streetlights into dim, bleeding glows. My mirrors reflected glimpses of movement that vanished whenever I tried to focus on them. Every alley I passed seemed longer than before, more convoluted. It felt like the city itself was bending around me, reshaping to keep me inside its walls. I tried to distract myself, focusing on the next delivery, but the unease followed me relentlessly. The packages in the back of the van seemed heavier, almost pulsing with their own weight. I could swear they shifted on their own, moving as though aware of me, aware of my fear. Every turn I made, every stop I passed, the feeling of being followed grew stronger, more insistent. Eventually I reached a wider street, the only traffic a few distant headlights cutting through the mist. But even here, the shadows clung unnaturally to the edges of buildings, stretching like living things. I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye, and when I looked, there was nothing until a shadow flickered across the sidewalk, moving in a way that defied logic. My pulse spiked, my chest tightening, and I realized that the feeling of being observed wasn't leaving. Finally, I arrived at a small apartment complex, older than most I had seen, with peeling paint and a cracked walkway. I delivered the package quickly, placing it on the doorstep, but my eyes were drawn to the window above. Curtains shifted slightly, though the building appeared empty. My stomach sank. Every house, every hallway, every delivery felt like it had been watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. As I drove away, I noticed a wet trail across the porch I had just left, dark and glistening in the streetlights. It led nowhere, stopping abruptly as if whatever had left it vanished mid-step. I blinked, trying to convince myself it was just rain or dirt, but the instinctive terror in my gut told me otherwise. Something about these deliveries wasn't right. Something had followed me from the outskirts. Something patient, something that now knew I existed. By the time I reached the main road again, the city felt different. Streets curved where they shouldn't, buildings loomed closer, and every reflection in my mirrors seemed distorted. And in the back of the van, the packages pulsed faintly, as if aware of my fear, whispering softly to one another, their voices barely audible but impossible to ignore. I gripped the wheel tighter, knowing that I had crossed a line, that whatever had started with the first delivery wasn't finished, and the worst was yet to come. My hands were trembling as I gripped the steering wheel, the van rattling beneath me as if it sensed my panic. The streets outside were dead, deserted, and yet every few seconds I caught a movement in the shadows at the edge of my vision. It always disappeared when I turned my head, but the feeling of being watched pressed down harder with every mile. The city I thought I knew had transformed into something alien, warped, as if reality itself was bending around me. Every turn I took seemed to lead me farther from safety, deeper into a maze I didn't understand. The next delivery was supposed to be routine, but I barely remembered the address. My GPS flickered again, rerouting me through streets that didn't exist in my memory, twisting past crumbling brick buildings and rusted fences that clawed at the fog. The streetlights were broken or dead, and the mist had grown so thick it seemed to leak into the van itself. I could hear faint whispers through the air vents, unintelligible murmurs that rose and fell like waves, sometimes soft and distant, other times sharp and close enough to make my skin crawl. When I finally reached the house, I realized I had never been anywhere like it before. The structure was enormous, almost mansion-like, with ivy climbing its walls, windows that reflected only darkness, and a front door that seemed impossibly tall. A faint light flickered behind one of the curtains, but the glow was sickly, greenish, unnatural. My stomach tightened as I grabbed the package from the van, its weight heavier than it should have been, and carried it toward the door. The moment I stepped onto the porch, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the entire house. My heart leaped, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. The interior was dark, completely empty, but the smell hit me immediately, sour and metallic, like old blood mixed with damp wood. I could hear a faint, rhythmic tapping from somewhere deep within the house, though I couldn't tell where. The sound seemed alive, deliberate, echoing off walls that twisted and warped in the shadows. I set the package down carefully, stepping back, and felt a brush of movement against my arm. I spun around, but there was nothing. The shadows clung to the corners of the rooms, stretching unnaturally, pooling along the floors and ceilings. I realized then that the house was not just empty, it was alive. It breathed around me, shifted subtly when I moved, and the air itself seemed to pulse with some unholy rhythm. A whisper floated through the darkness, low and insistent, repeating my name, circling me in a way that made it impossible to ignore. My chest tightened with fear, and I tried to turn back toward the door, but it wasn't there. The house had shifted again, the hallway stretching impossibly long, the walls curving at impossible angles. The package in my hands trembled, pulsing with light from within, faint but unmistakable, as though whatever was inside wanted me to notice it. I wanted to leave, but every direction I tried led me deeper into the house. Rooms repeated themselves, hallways looping back impossibly, and the shadows seemed to follow, moving just at the edge of my vision. I could hear wet scraping sounds on the floor behind me, like nails or claws dragging across the wood, though no one was there. Panic gripped me, cold and tight, making it hard to breathe. Suddenly I realized the walls were no longer just walls, they were faces, faces pressed faintly against the plaster, hollow eyes staring, mouths open in silent screams. They shifted as I moved, twisting grotesquely, and the whispering grew louder, insistent, demanding. My legs shook, my hands were slick with sweat, and I felt the impossible weight of the house itself pressing down on me, as if it were aware I had come inside. I stumbled forward, almost collapsing, when I noticed faint, wet handprints appearing across the floor, forming a trail that led both nowhere and everywhere. Each print looked human, but elongated, misshapen, and glistening with dark fluid. My pulse raced, my mind screaming at me to run, but there was no exit, no direction that led back to safety. The van, the city, everything I had known seemed like a distant memory, replaced by this living nightmare. The package quivered violently in my hands, and I saw the faint outlines of small, distorted faces pressed against the wrapping from the inside. Their eyes were wide and hollow, their mouths opening and closing, as if trying to speak, scream, or warn me. I froze, a deep, primal terror rooting me to the spot. The whispers converged around me, circling, pressing in, and I realized with a cold certainty that the house had been waiting for me all along. It wasn't just a delivery anymore, it was a trap. And in that moment, I understood whatever I had been carrying, the packages, the houses, that the fog outside the mansion had thickened into a suffocating wall of gray, curling around the van like living smoke. Inside the house seemed to pulse with a slow, deliberate rhythm, the shadows stretching and twisting as if they were breathing. My hands were shaking violently as I carried the package deeper into the endless hallways, each step echoing unnaturally, bouncing off walls that warped and shifted in ways that defied reason. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to run, to leave, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the floor, as if the house itself held me in place. The package quivered in my hands, heavier than before, its edges pulsing faintly with light from inside. I couldn't ignore the faint shapes pressing against the wrapping, teeny distorted faces, their eyes wide and empty, mouths opening and closing in silent screams. I tried to drop it, but it hovered for a second before landing softly at my feet. The whispering that had followed me all night converged into a low, insistent chorus, circling around me, urging me forward and trapping me at the same time. I stumbled down a hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls bending and folding impossibly. Doors appeared where there shouldn't have been any, and rooms repeated themselves in grotesque loops. The floor beneath me was slick with dark, wet stains, and I realized with growing horror that faint handprints were forming behind me, leading nowhere yet multiplying endlessly. The whispers grew louder, layered over each other, and the air was thick with the metallic smell of decay. Then I saw a TA figure at the end of the hallway, tall, skeletal, impossibly thin, its face hidden in shadow. It didn't move, yet I felt its attention, a gaze so heavy it pressed against my skull. My pulse spiked and I wanted to run, but every hallway, every door I tried led me back to the same spot, the same figure, the same oppressive darkness. The shadows stretched toward me from the walls and ceiling, writhing like living things. And I realized they were not just shadows, they were the remnants of the people I had delivered to, their faces pressed into the walls, eyes hollow, mouths frozen in eternal screams. I backed up, tripping over the package again, and when I looked at it, the wrapping had split open. Dozens of tiny, grotesque faces pressed against each other, writhing and murmuring incoherently, their expressions twisted in terror. My stomach churned as I realized these were not packages, not in the ordinary sense. They were vessels, containing something that had been waiting for me, patient, watching, aware. The whispers turned into cries, desperate and urgent, filling the hallways with a cacophony of suffering. I ran blindly, the figure following at the edge of my vision, and the hallways twisted in impossible ways, turning into a labyrinth of horror. Every door I opened led to another identical corridor, another looping hallway, another glimpse of the skeletal figure at the far end. I began to feel the weight of the house pressing down, the darkness seeping into my skin, filling my lungs with icy fear. My reflection appeared on a polished surface, distorted, my eyes too large, my mouth stretched in a silent scream, my skin pale and lifeless. And then, just as I thought I would be swallowed entirely, I saw a door slightly ajar, with a faint, normal-looking light spilling through. My heart leaped. Could this be the exit? Desperate, I ran toward it, nearly tripping on the warped floorboards. I pushed the door open and stepped outside, and the city looked normal again. Streets quiet, streetlights glowing softly, the fog gone, as if nothing had ever happened. My van was parked where I had left it, ordinary and solid, the GPS glowing with my next delivery. I exhaled shakily, relief washing over me, but then I noticed the package sitting in the back seat, unchanged, sealed. My name was written on it in neat handwriting, the ink dark and wet. My stomach turned cold. I hadn't brought it here, I hadn't placed it myself. The whispers returned, faint at first, brushing against my ears, and I could feel eyes on me from every shadowed corner of the city. I wanted to leave, to drive away as fast as possible, but a compulsion gripped me, a silent pull toward the van and that package. I couldn't shake the certainty that whatever had been inside the mansion, whatever had followed me through the endless hallways and the shifting shadows, was still here. It had found me again. I sat in the driver's seat, hands frozen over the steering wheel, staring at the package. It pulsed faintly like a heartbeat, a soft glow emanating from inside, and I realized with horror that this nightmare was far from over. It had begun with a single delivery, and now it had attached itself to me, patient, waiting, knowing I had nowhere to hide. I didn't move. I couldn't. The city around me seemed quiet, ordinary, but I knew better. The whispers were still there, just beneath the surface, and the package in my backseat waited, as if it had a life of its own. I had survived the night, but the truth was chilling and unavoidable. This was only the beginning. And whatever it was, it would come for me again.